Okay, here we are, our last panel of the day. And for those of you who are still with us, which as I can tell from the numbers looks to be quite a few, we have quite a finale for you. Just amazing. This is a real honor for all of us today because our next spotlight speaker is perhaps one of the most important government prosecutors in the world, Sean Newell, the acting chief of the National Security Cyber. Sean cut his teeth as a trial attorney, like so many today, in DOJ section of the U.S. in the DOJ as a trial attorney, which included being on the prosecution team that obtained the first ever criminal charges against state-sponsored cyber actors, the May 2014 indictment of 5 members of China's People Liberation Army in the United States versus Wang Dong et al. A lengthy track record. What's so interesting about Sean is not just that he's been a member of these prosecution teams and provided DOJ program management for just about every single security-related DOJ technical operation or cyber prosecution, but he's also the first ever chief of the National Security Cyber Section, NatSec for short. This new section of DOJ, and he competed for the job like everybody else, is wholly devoted to disrupting and prosecuting cyber threats to national security. So it's really the first section of its kind, and we have the first leader of it right here. He's a high-tech Batman meets Superman, but instead of protecting Gotham City or Metropolis, he's protecting the streets of the entire world. And we are thrilled to have him here today. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And then our final panelist of the day, who better to moderate this spotlight than one of the more experienced international cyber lawyers there is, David Lashway, co-chair of Sidley's global privacy and cybersecurity practice, who has managed incident responses all over the world, including in China, North Korea, and Libya. We never know. David is a veteran of these forums. We never know where he's calling from. It is never from his office, never from his desk. And if you ask him about where he is, he usually just makes some kind of joke because he doesn't want to tell you. He's far more than the traditional breach coach. He'll also lead all the data breach related litigation, the remediation, all the regulatory and criminal matters that arise out of any data breach. He will lead those. And if the company blames its vendors for the breach, David will represent them too, either side. He served as lead counsel of the cyber investigation, working the hack of the 2016 US presidential election. But what you might not glean from David's bio is that David, with his own personal style of fierce intensity and mammoth legal acumen, he is James Bond meets Liam Neeson of incident response, with very special skills, fluent in multiple languages, playing at a very high level of what he would call incident response arbitrage. So David, take us away, finish us out. Sean, tell us what's going on and how you're protecting us. So enjoy things, guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much for a great day, John, and thank you, Bruce, as well. You know, another great series of sessions and discussions today across a range of topics, both in the ransomware, extortion, as well as just good old-fashioned cybersecurity crime arenas. What a great discussion. We're delighted to be asked by you all to end the day and to capstone this. I think, John, as you mentioned, I think all of us are very fortunate to have Sean with us this afternoon. As you can imagine, he's got an incredibly demanding schedule in light of the current stand-up of the new operations within the National Security Division, particularly the cyber team that he's now leading and starting up and making sure not only that we have the people, but the processes, the technology, and the capabilities to establish a unit that's fit for purpose and can fulfill the mission that's envisioned by that important new program. So delighted to have Sean here. I think for all of us who have been in the trenches for the last 20 years or so, working cyber-related matters, Sean is not a new name to any of us. He was there in the trench with us on a lot of these cases over the years that John just mentioned and we've talked about in many sessions today, as well as in past sessions. Sean is one of those folks who has been down deep in the trench, maybe not on the front line name, but now will be in his new role, of course. And we're absolutely delighted to have one of our trench warriors in this cyber world now leading probably the most important, I think for a lot of us, the most important law enforcement organization and cybersecurity in the world, as John mentioned. So, Sean, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time. And I think, as John mentioned, your new unit really does have, two missions or two purposes. One is disruption, and one is prosecution. Just recently, working with the private sector and other public sector partners, both here in the U.S., some of whom we heard from earlier today during the various sessions, and around the world, you've already found some early successes with the program that you're now leading. And I was wondering if we could maybe kick off with those. I think in cyber, we're always looking at, the cup is half empty, and it's always the offense that has the advantage. But I do think we're moving the needle here, and your leadership is no doubt going to continue with that. But I'd love for you to just start us off, if you would, with a little bit about some of the recent quick hits, quick wins that you've already realized since taking over the position.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for those kind words of introduction. And it is really an honor to be here today with all of you and to close out today's festivities. So I think, taking a step back a little bit, David mentioned disruption and prosecution as kind of being our two roles. We actually, the way I like to frame it is we have one role and one role only, and that is disruption. Prosecution is one means of disrupting. Sometimes we will go down that path, but even though we're prosecutors and we work with FBI agents and U.S. Secret Service agents for law enforcement, we see prosecution, actually arresting an individual and bringing them to a courtroom and trying them and getting a jail sentence at the end of the day is one of the most effective disruption options you can have. But we are realistic in that we live in a world where so many of our adversaries, whether they are state-sponsored, and when I say state-sponsored, I mean they're a card-carrying member of an intelligence service or a military unit or a proxy for a foreign government. So many of our state-sponsored adversaries, or so many of our transnational criminal organization adversaries. So you think the ransomware actors, the folks who are standing up these ransomware as a service organizations, really fueling the ransomware scourge. There's no better disruption than pulling them off the battlefield, the cyber battlefield, so to speak. But as I mentioned, they are protected oftentimes, or even if they don't work for the government, they're living in a country that is a safe haven that allows them to conduct those activities, turns a blind eye to those activities, likely for geopolitical reasons or to eventually leverage them for their own geopolitical purposes down the road. So we really have to be realistic and look at other ways that we can disrupt these threats. And that was why that kind of theme is you'll find in the administration's national cybersecurity strategy. You'll find it throughout. That was the impetus for saying that DOJ needed resources that are dedicated to disrupting the cyber threat. This recognition that we need people who are focused on this and who have to think beyond just prosecution. And that was really the reason they stood up our section. So when I talk about what other disruption options do we bring to the table and do we aim for at DOJ, and that really is across the board. We will do our investigations and we'll take the threat intel from those investigations and push them out to network defenders. I think you can see the tempo of the FBI's and DHS CISA's cybersecurity advisories really has increased over the years, and those are fueled in large part by our investigations. And the information we're gleaning during those investigations. We are looking at working with our doing court-authorized technical operations. We've done quite a few of those over the years, both in the criminal context and in the national security context. The criminal context, I can point you to the Hive and the Alpha Black Cat operations, where the FBI agents infiltrated the networks of these ransomware groups and started swiping the decryption keys underneath their noses and providing them to victims without them realizing it. Just Deputy Assistant Attorney General Lisa Monaco likes to refer to those as operations as hacking the hackers. On the national security side of the house, we've taken down a number of botnets that the adversaries in China and Russia are using to conduct their operations. One I always like to point to, because I'm pretty proud of it, is March 2022, shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they stood up a botnet to conduct their nefarious activities, the military intelligence of the Russian armed forces. And then we swooped in and neutered that botnet right at the time when you would expect them to use this brand new shiny tool they spent years developing, millions of dollars developing, they were probably used against Ukraine, and we swept in and basically took down that botnet, took a tool out of their hands. So we're looking at those kind of court-authorized technical operations that are very important to our work, and then also partnering with our partners in the U.S. government and the private sector. So when I say the U.S. government, we are supporting sanctions designations. We are working with Cyber Command to enable their operations outside the United States. We're also working with our partners at the Department of State to provide information they can use in their diplomatic efforts, maybe to push back on some of these safe havens. So across the board, disruption is the name of the game at DOJ these days when it comes to cyber. And I think it's important to also know that the reason disruption is so important is to realize it really fit well into our victim first mantra here, which is everything we need to do here at DOJ is to help the victims. And by sitting back and watching the criminals and the nation state actors harm our economy, harm our private sector and the like, and even our government, all with the hopes that maybe someday getting under seal charges and arresting them, while that's a laudable goal, we are really doing a disservice to our constituencies if we're not, in the interim, while we are still waiting to someday arrest these folks, trying to contest the space and make the bad guys' lives a lot more difficult.
I think a number of the points that you raised with respect to some of the recent disruption effort successes really causes a lot of us, I think, to question and continue to interrogate, as we typically would, every one of these case studies. I think a lot of us cooperating and working closely with you and others in government to bring out those types of results from the private sector perspective. No doubt you and we collectively have views on certain efficacy determinations. That is, are there ways in which we can make these outcomes more efficacious? And can we get there faster? Can we increase the speed or the tempo at which we're going on these efforts? So one question it raises, of course, is authority questions. In light of the fact that you guys have now been in the game with the private sector, and before we get to what the private sector can do more of that would be beneficial for you, how about just your authorities? Are you finding that you have sufficient authorities these days? Are you exploring additional authorities or the grant of additional authorities in order to affect a greater amount of efficacy of these disruption efforts? Or do you have sufficient authorities based on your experience so far?
Well, I think there are some more authorities we could use or that we could have renewed, and you might know where I'm going with this one, but the one that comes to mind immediately is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That is authority, for those who aren't familiar, allows the United States government to gather foreign intelligence without a warrant by targeting overseas actors. That was set to expire in, I think, December, so at the end of last year. And we got a short reprieve. Congress acted to kick the deadline on that expiration to April of this year. But that authority, I can't say how important it is in my day-to-day work, in the FBI's day-to-day work, in disrupting cyber threats. So we're not talking just terrorists or spies, but cyber threats as well. And bottom line, Section 702 of FISA, having that around means improved cybersecurity for everyone. So I think number one priority for us is ensuring that authority continues beyond April 2024. Outside that context, I think we're in pretty good shape on our charging authorities, on the authorities that allow us to do those technical operations that I described to you, a lot of which are done pursuant to a Rule 41 search warrant, where the judge has to approve. But outside that context, we've engaged with the administration on the Hill a little bit with improvements in some of our authorities to allow us to combat money laundering using cryptocurrency, looking to kind of improve and enhance our civil and criminal forfeiture authorities in the context of cryptocurrency and other ill-gotten digital assets. And we actually have, I think, put a few proposals out on the table, and I'm hoping that someone picks that up on the Hill and we'll run with it in this next year.
With respect to private sector participation, and obviously changing the authority model, then when you have access to the private sector and those kind of capabilities that they can bring to bear, and sometimes more quickly and with a little bit less process, how are you seeing the cooperation levels? I think the sense that a lot of us have had in this space, working in the trench with folks like yourself, and obviously we're beginning to work with your office now that you've stood it up much more proactively. We've seen, highly efficacious outcomes much more rapidly, at a velocity and a pace that's very different from the past. Are there things that we need to be doing in the private sector to further that cooperative effort in order to get those outcomes?
I think The one thing I like to say when I get this type of question is, first and foremost, when I was referring to partnerships earlier, like private sector front and center in our partnerships, you would be hard pressed to ask me to name, and I would be hard pressed to provide you an answer of any of our technical operations or disruptions that we've done that haven't had some sort of private sector cooperation behind it. Sometimes our private sector partners would prefer to kind of stand in the background, and that's fine with us. Other times we actually do thank them publicly. So I mentioned the Cyclops Blink takedown against the GRU botnet, for example. WatchGuard, a company that manufactured a lot of devices that the GRU had compromised, really worked very hard with us to come up with a technical solution that allowed us to rip those devices back from the GRU and help prevent their reinfection. And so that's just one example, but I think, Hafnium takedown, where we disrupted a Chinese intelligence service botnet. Microsoft was extremely important in helping us there. And sometimes when we charge and arrest actors, we're taking down their infrastructure, and we're oftentimes not doing that because we're compelling with the court order, but because a lot of these entities out there are voluntarily, based on violations of their terms of service, also taking the actors' infrastructure away from them at a time that coincides with our own U.S. government disruption operations. So I think everyone in the U.S. government, at least in the Department of Justice, is drunk the Kool-Aid when it comes to, we have to find ways to work with the private sector and increase the scale and tempo of that cooperative work. I think the one kind of suggestion I have for folks is, we talk about authorities. We have a lot of authorities in the U.S. government to do these disruptions, either DOJ or elsewhere. But I think a lot of the really creative ideas that are being generated there for how to conduct those disruption operations are by folks in the cybersecurity community. And so I think we need to find, you have ideas, we have authorities, with our powers combined, we can really make a difference and start moving the needle here in the cybersecurity context. And that's kind of my appeal is, let us know if you're seeing something and you think there might be an opportunity, because maybe you don't have the authority as a private citizen, but we can add your ideas to our authorities and really make a difference.
You mentioned a number of joint efforts like WatchGuard, where you had nation-state actors really driving the manipulation, the exploits there. A number of those, and the bot takedowns, et cetera. Let's turn a little bit to nation-state ransomware. Obviously, today's topic throughout the day has been on ransomware. Will you talk a little bit about your office's priorities and how you're going to approach nation-state ransomware matters? And again, authority issues there, and what do we need to be thinking about when we're going to be tackling what I think many expect, and the White House has indicated we should be expecting increased levels of nation-state related ransomware activity in the coming year and years ahead.
Yeah, so I think you're right. We are definitely seeing some nation-state actors engaging in ransomware activity. Now, the reasons they're engaging in activity, I think I'd probably bucket them in two different buckets. One, you have some nation-state actors that want to conduct activities while pretending that they are criminals. So they will conduct a ransomware attack, maybe to distract network defenders and the like, while they are in turn trying to do something else. So we have that bucket. We've seen that in particular. We had one case where there were some individuals who were working for Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they were conducting hacking activity on the side, as well as doing ransomware. And I think there was a dual purpose there of distracting network defenders while going after targets that they wanted, but also just being a general nuisance to the United States, which is part of their mission statement, I guess, as well. And the other bucket that I point to is really North Korea at this point in time. We've had a few cases where we've seen North Korean actors doing ransomware attacks. Well, we think that is actually revenue driven. North Korea has gotten very creative in using cyber-enabled means to generate revenue for the regime, for the weapons program. Ransomware is one. We see a lot of cryptocurrency heists is another method that they're using, or they have these armies of internet or information technology workers who are pretending to be Western IT workers who are actually North Korean, and they're doing all this coding work for Western firms pretending to be based in California or elsewhere. And then in some instances, we've seen that coding work then leveraged to allow for an intrusion after the fact. So North Korea is another animal out there that is really engaging in ransomware and the similar activities for revenue generation purposes and sanctions evasion. As far as how we are disrupting them, I think we're taking the same approach that we are with the transnational criminal organizations, which is we're going to tackle these individuals, try to find out who they are, where they are, disrupt them, disrupt the revenue stream, seize the cryptocurrency back, things along those lines. But we're also looking for key nodes in the ransomware ecosystem because it's interesting. The nation state actors and the transnational criminal organizations are relying on these same key nodes in the criminal ecosystem, which is initial access brokers. They're selling access on these darknet forums. The money laundering entities that are allowing them to, once they extort the crypto or they steal the crypto, to then launder that and bring it back home to fill their own pockets. So you see us take a lot of actions against cryptocurrency mixers, illicit cryptocurrency exchanges, money launderers in China and elsewhere, because we see them as they don't care who they're working for, and both the nation states and the transnational criminal organizations really rely on them to make their crime happen. So it's those key nodes that we're trying to disrupt on the criminal and nation state side in the ransomware context.
How are you seeing that play out a little bit differently where we've got just the straight extortion cases? You know, some of the earlier panels today were discussing Scattered Spider, Alfie, and some of the other matters, including your recent takedown that we discussed and many of us were involved in. Just the straight extortion cases. I think a number of us that lead practices in this area and have participated over the last year, certainly the last quarter, from September 1st through December 31st. I think we've seen more just straight extortion cases than we had ever seen in the past, as opposed to the malware plus the extortion, so the ransomware type model. That lineup leads to a little bit of a different charge, right? You got a different jury instruction, same statutes at play, 1030 and otherwise. But how are you thinking about those cases and how to manage those where we don't see the operational interference necessarily of the malware, of the encrypting malware, but we're just seeing the straight and break in, steal the stuff, and then extort?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a difficult nut to crack. We have looked at the past in whether or not there are opportunities for the U.S. government working with the private sector, primarily the victims, who would notify us very quickly to go out and grab the data before it is used in extortion, take the data back from the actors. But what we found years ago when we first started looking at this is those actors, once they get a hold of data, they're copying it and creating backups and the like. So it really is tough to, once they're in, and take it to prevent them from leveraging that down the road. So again, I think our best bet in those circumstances is to target the actors themselves, target the infrastructure they're using to publicize the data at the end of the day. But that latter tactic is pretty hard because you take down a dark website, leak site, it's not hard for them to stand up another one somewhere else. So it is a tough nut to crack. I'm not sure we have the right answers to it just yet. And it would be interested in the private sector bar's perspective and how they're advising their clients to deal with that, because within the Department of Justice, our options are limited.
Yeah, thinking about that a little bit, with the new section, you've got the criminal section, right, sitting with you in this joint initiative where things that may stay below the line, stay with the criminal division, and your section on the national security side. Let's talk a little bit about critical infrastructure and the types of indicators that are going to trigger your attention for your office and the work that you guys are doing. That is, what brings it to a national security concern that would then therefore hit your desk and be something that you guys would lead? What do those criteria look like as opposed to a standard charge under 1030 as a commercial crime?
Yeah, so anything targeting critical infrastructure is immediately going to be elevated across the board, whether it's a criminal group conducting activity or the nation state group. I think, when we see the criminals targeting critical infrastructure, it really is mostly in the ransomware context. Them seeing that as a way to really jack up the ransom payment. The more critical the network is, the more money they can charge to get it unlocked. But we have seen some interesting dynamics where some entities will actually back away from critical infrastructure because they know it causes the U.S. government to turn its attention and resources. It immediately moves them up the priority scale. And I think pointing to the Colonial Pipeline was a good example of that. Several years ago, where there was, I think it was dark. I might mispronounce it, dark matter, or anyway, the group there.
The dark side group.
Yeah, dark side. Excuse me. Thank you.
Yep.
They were, relatively low on the priority scale. Once they hit Colonial Pipeline, they really moved up pretty high. But I think on the national security side of the house, we really are worried about critical infrastructure, and I think in the context of our nation-state adversaries holding critical infrastructure at risk in preparation for a future conflict. Folks here might be familiar with Bolt Typhoon reporting. Microsoft came out and said the PRC has compromised critical infrastructure. It appears they're doing so in order to leverage that compromise for use in a future cross-strait conflict. I think we're gonna, if the government maybe step back and not endorse the motives there so much, but we did come out with a cybersecurity advisory, basically, I think, confirming what Microsoft is seeing and enriching Microsoft's data with our own about that. And that's something for me, looking ahead to 2024, that my unit is going to be focused, have laser focus on that issue, is how do we identify and figure out which critical infrastructure networks are now being held hostage, and then how do we disrupt the nation-state adversaries' hold on those critical networks that we do identify are at risk.
Let's talk a little bit about those nation-state frameworks. So we've got obviously the kinetic events going on in Ukraine, and then a lot of us that are doing work on the ground along with U.S. government and other governments, but a lot of private sector players on the ground supporting the defense of Ukraine with SBU and other key partners in Ukraine in order to ensure their cyber defense. We've seen a lot. I mean, just the first week, right, as widely reported, the 7 wipers that we saw just in the first few days of the conflict, going back to that early February stage. But time and again, we're seeing attacks against critical infrastructure, including over the holidays, over the last 45 days, where a lot of us were doing work there. Taiwan with the election, lies election, just in the last week, obviously sending a very big signal, despite the split in the electorate and the actual electoral numbers that came out in support of the candidates. The Chinese were sent a loud signal. And obviously we've got even issues in our hemisphere in Ecuador. Just over the last week, that you guys are tracking closely within the National Security Division. How are you envisioning, year ahead, 2-3 years ahead, going into 28, when some more dire predictions have been made around when we may see or expect to see more kinetic conflict potentially, for example, in Taiwan, the cyber escalation, and the work that you're going to need to be doing as an organization, and frankly, what the private sector is going to have to be doing with you in order to support that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Ukraine is a great case study, and I'll focus on that, even though I could probably also speak to the Israel-Gaza crisis as well. But I think what we saw in Ukraine, cyber was a part of the war. I think maybe some observers think that had a less effect than maybe anticipated. I think the case study is the reasons why it had less of effect than anticipated are going to be great, and I think there actually probably going to be a lot of scholarly activity about that going forward. I think kind of lessons learned on that resilience front, partnerships, both with the private sector partnering with Ukraine, in which there was an incredible amount of partnership. We really have to give the private sector kudos for stepping up in that context. I know you, David, and many other folks that were involved kind of the front line of that. We had Microsoft identifying and helping Ukraine remediate wiper malware before it was even used. Obviously, there was some wiper malware that could not be interdicted before it was used, but fortunately, it didn't have a huge effect because Kinetic just overshadowed everything. I talked about the Cyclops Blink botnet that we took down. Again, we were trying to help the Ukrainians in that regard with the timing. I think, between maybe some planning on the part of the Russians and everyone, governments in the U.S. and in Europe, in the private sector stepping up to plate to help Ukraine, we probably tamped down on that as much as we could hope. I don't know if we can count on all the stars aligning in future conflicts. We need to try to make that happen in that type of scenario repeat, perhaps in the context of Taiwan. And I think it's really important that, again, we look at Ukraine, we take the lessons learned from that, which again, to me, is governments and private sector both bring things to bear and try to leverage that for future events. But again, just because cyber didn't play the huge role in Ukraine as some folks thought it might, I don't think we can say that that's going to be the case in 2028. It's because also our adversaries who are also looking at how Russia used cyber, and they're learning how to do it better. And so we're all learning lessons, and we all need to make sure that we got to learn our lessons better than the adversaries.
We're expecting, obviously, with AI, there were some discussions earlier today, and a lot of discussions occurring on Capitol Hill and in capitals around the world, and some, our Five Eyes allies as well as others, around the role of AI and cybersecurity, both for the offender as well as the defender, and the advantage that the defender currently may have, but certainly the offender is going to have. How are you viewing those types of technical advancements, bumping those up against your current authorities and capabilities as an organization to continue to affect your mission, which is so vitally important?
So are you speaking with regard to how are we going to match the threat actors' use of AI?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly, I think in the context of your point about China and Taiwan, we're obviously already beginning to see that, and we would expect to see that, a lot of us, right, in the coming days and years.
Yeah, I think we're first keeping our eyes on when it comes to AI is 2024 elections. In that context, I know that we generally folks are going to still do the same type of activity to disrupt and maybe influence our election processes, but AI just is generative AI specifically is not going to change the risks. It's going to make those existing risks more dangerous and more difficult to deal with. But as far as the criminals and the nation states using AI, I think we are seeing actors using that kind of for low-level improvements to their spear phishing activities to help them tinker with their malware. It's lowering the bar for new people to join. It's causing existing sophisticated actors to have new capabilities to make their tools even better. So it is kind of a perfect storm, and I think we are trying to at least work closely with the AI companies here in the U.S. to understand their tools, to understand how their tools might be leveraged for malicious purposes, and then work together with them to figure out how to disrupt it, because they have an equal, I think, reason to get on top of this, because they're trying to improve their own threat detection algorithms to ensure there's not abuse of their tools. We're trying to prevent the bad guys from using their tools, so we put our information together, again, a public-private partnership. That's where we're going to have the most effect on kind of getting ahead of the threat actors' use of AI.
Sean, thank you. No, it's been terrific. This conversation's been really rich. I think a lot of us have benefited from it. I'm going to ask you just maybe a closing remark. Any closing thoughts on, as we start 2024, we're just days into 2024. You've got a heck of a mission ahead. We know you're going to be working nonstop. It's an important one. Any final thoughts from you before we close out?
I think the thoughts I would say is take to heart the messages I made about public-private partnership and really just the receptiveness we have to that. The more information we have about, from a victim or from a cybersecurity researcher that sees people being victim and knows how they're being victimized, and coming together and kind of combining our two sauces is really where we're going to make a difference. And you'll see that in the National Cybersecurity Strategy. You've heard it from me today. I think that should tell everyone in this audience that, we are ready. We want to partner. We want to work together. We are open to it, and let's make it happen in 2024.
Look, there could have been a lot of people in this first new role of the chief of this new section. I think all of us are very fortunate. The U.S. is very fortunate, and as John mentioned, I think our allies around the world are very fortunate to have you in this position. Thank you for taking so much of your time today to talk with us. You've been clearly accretive to the discussions today, and we know that you're going to do great things to help defend the country and prosecute these crimes and investigate them and protect national security in the days ahead. So thank you, Sean, very much.
Yeah, and likewise, thanks to you, David, for all the work that you do, and the folks in the audience here. I know you guys are network defenders. They were talking about me being in the trenches. Well, I've done some cybersecurity work for the department. I know all you network defenders out there are really the ones in the trenches on a daily, hourly basis. So thank you to the work you all do too.
Yeah, Sean, thanks a lot. Very fortunate to have you in this position. Very grateful that you were able to spend some time with us today for this conference and join and share your insights. So thank you so much. And David, terrific job moderating. Just to wrap up, so that's the end of the day here. I want to thank the 23 world-class law and consulting firms that were represented here today as sponsors and participants and supporters of this event. And of course, thank you all for being with us today for this virtual event. I hope we will see you again soon. Take care.